Hello, my name is Thomas. Thank you very much for downloading this episode of British Culture Albion Never Dies. And we're back to the Alphabet of Britishness. Thank you very much to everybody who sent your suggestions for R. Thank you very much for your patience. Of course, moving country from the United States back to the United Kingdom. My whole life was up in the air, but finally I'm able to get back to R. And yes, S will come later. But R, as you can see, is for royalty. That was suggested on Instagram by Two Green Thumbs and British Bond Addict, both based in the UK. Mr. Leo RB Berlin, of course based in Germany. N. Slayton, Ladies Who Bond, both based in the United States. 007_HMSS, I don't know where you're based, sir, somewhere on the internet. And on Facebook, Debbie and Martin. So overwhelmingly, people said R is for royalty. I couldn't avoid it. I have previously covered some royal topics before. For example, K is for kings, knights and knaves. And I also did M is for monarchy. I covered what does a monarch actually do day to day, really focusing on our current Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. And of course, I did Q is for Queen, covering Boadicea, Maud Matilda, Lady Jane Grey and others. I really want to focus on some of those lesser known queens. So, I can't avoid the topic. R is for royalty, members of the family, including kings and queens, but also including members of the family who are not the rulers. So it could include, for example, those who never made it to be king. So, for example, Edward the Black Prince, born 1330 but died 1376 before he could become king. Arthur Tudor, we very, very nearly had a King Arthur. He was the older brother to Henry VIII, but he sadly died 1502. Henry Frederick Stuart, Prince of Wales, the older brother to Charles I. So he died before he could become king, before he could inherit. Meaning that, of course, we got Charles I, so goodness knows how our history might have been different. On O is for Oliver Cromwell, I covered certain bits of Charles I's life and really how we fell into the Civil War. And then, of course, there's James Francis Edward Stuart, famed among the Jacobites. But I'll focus on the modern day, something a bit closer. I'll look at the royal family as it is today. Obvious place to go, www.royal.uk/roll-family. Basically, what is the role of the royal family? According to the website, they support the Queen in her many state and national duties, as well as carrying out important work in areas of public and charitable service and helping to strengthen national unity and stability. Those who undertake official duties are members of the Queen's close family, her children, grandchildren, their spouses, and the Queen's cousins, and every year the royal family as a whole carries out over 2,000 official engagements throughout the UK and worldwide. The people who take most of those duties are what we know as the senior royals. I had a look at a Town and Country magazine article on this. They asked, what does the term senior royal actually mean? And they describe it as pretty nebulous. It's one that's never been officially defined by the British royal family, typically used to refer to those adult relatives of the British monarch who are high up in the line of succession and their spouses. But they're the full-time working members of the royal family performing regular duties in the Queen's name and highly visible representatives of the monarchy both in the UK and abroad. So, again, looking at the numbers on the official royal website, 2,000 the number of official engagements carried out by the royal family each year in the UK and overseas, 70,000 the number of people entertained each year to dinners, lunches, receptions, garden parties, and 100,000 the number of letters received and answered each year by the royal family. Of course, some members of the royal family have established their own charities, such as the Prince's Trust, Duke of Edinburgh's Award Scheme, the Princess Royal Trust for Carers, and they have a very, very important role in recognising and supporting the work of the armed services. And of course, they play a role in strengthening national unity. It doesn't say this explicitly on their website, but I think the pandemic has been a really good example of how, whilst we may have had very different opinions among ourselves about what to do and how, the Queen's speeches during the pandemic, I think, did provide a unifying influence and really helped people work together from all political persuasions. I think that role was invaluable. Of course, sometimes the Queen herself is unable to attend an engagement, so members of her family will undertake something local, something specialist, which should otherwise be forced to decline. Then again, you never know. I mean, quite a few of us saw years ago a couple invited the Queen to their small wedding for a joke, but she she accepted, and she came to just a little wedding. So you never know what she's going to accept. Again, browsing through, I love doing these topics because, it's not just from my head, it's not just off the top of my head. I really like to see these topics and then have a quick Google, root around, see if I can go beyond the first page of Google results and find something out for myself. So I was flicking through the Reader's Digest, and it said the Queen is the only living head of state who served in World War II. Which I thought was really, really interesting. Of course, she underwent a 6-week auto mechanic training course at Aldershot in Surrey, and by July had risen to the rank of second subaltern to junior commander. So she learned how to deconstruct, repair and rebuild engines and change tyres, and learned how to drive every type of machine she worked on. Jeeps, trucks, ambulances. One of her major joys, according to a 1947 magazine, was to get dirt under her nails and grease stains in her hands and display these signs of labour to her friends. And of course she still drives without a licence, because of course we get our licence to drive on the Queen's roads. She doesn't need her own permission to drive on her own roads. There are a few roads that can only be driven on by the Queen, and knowing this, that they're good walking paths and so on. So again, I think it was a Daily Mail piece a few years ago, a young couple walking along, pushing a pram, and then they suddenly heard a car horn behind them. They turned around and there was the Queen beeping at them to move out of the way. But yeah, the Queen always seems happy to be behind the wheel, on-road and off-road, I believe even now. So she took her duties seriously, making headlines around the world during the Second World War, being dubbed Princess Auto Mechanic. But of course, military service isn't unique to her. Prince Philip, of course, had a very, very interesting war record. Her sadly late husband, initially at the outbreak of the war, he considered joining the RAF. He wanted to be a fighter pilot, and there's a BBC article on this. Prince Philip told the BBC his chances of surviving war would have been reduced, but temperamentally he might have been well suited to it. But it was the intervention of his uncle, Louis Mountbatten, who was then the captain of the HMS Kelly, who persuaded him to follow his family's long naval tradition. So he took the usual path of an aspiring naval officer, entering Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, as a cadet and being commissioned as a midshipman. January 1940. He excelled at Dartmouth, winning the King's Dirk for the best all-round candidate of the term and the prize for best cadet in college. So when the King and Queen Elizabeth, that is King George VI's wife, Queen Elizabeth, together with their daughters Princess Elizabeth and Margaret, paid an official visit to the college in 1939. Philip was given the task of escorting the young princesses, and their governess, Marion Crawford, later recorded that he showed off a great deal, but he obviously made quite an impression on the 13-year-old Elizabeth, and it's a story that often goes around that as they sailed away, he got a small boat and was kind of sailing in and out, getting maybe a little bit too close. But he obviously made a memorable impression on her. Of course, at that time he was Prince of Greece, and Greece remained neutral at the outbreak of the war, so Philip, as potential heir to its throne and technically still a foreigner from our point of view, he was initially kept away from battle zones, but his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, pulled some strings and got his nephew posted to the battleship HMS Ramillies, escorting Australian troop convoys in the Indian Ocean. And then after a short spell on HMS Kent and HMS Shropshire, Philip transferred to the battleship HMS Valiant. So I found that really interesting. Wealthy, very well-connected young man, had his family pull strings to get him into the battle, the real battle. So Greece entering the war on the Allied side, was decided he could serve in the Mediterranean. He was in the Battle of Crete. He was mentioned in dispatches for his skill controlling the Valiant searchlights during the Battle of Cape Matapan, and it played a major role in the destruction of the Italian fleet. His industriousness was not in question. He's thought to have had one of the more interesting wars. For example, on RMS Empress of Russia, the troop ship found itself without stokers, so Philip himself went down to the boiler room and shoveled coal for so long his blistered hands couldn't hold a fork. Of course, promotion followed, posting to destroy HMS Wallace on the hazardous convoy duty in the North Sea. Again, took part in the Allied invasion of Sicily, and German dive bombers damaged HMS Wallace in a nighttime attack. The crew feared the enemy would return in greater numbers and finish them off, so Philip proposed launching a makeshift raft equipped with smoke floats, which in the darkness fooled the German bomb aimers into thinking this was the damaged destroyer. This came out in, I think, around 2003, the full story, as those who served on the ship came forward, actually praising Prince Philip's role. They said, Prince Philip saved our lives that night. He was always very courageous and resourceful and thought very quickly. Then he transferred to destroy HMS Whelp, supporting air raids on Japanese shore installations. So he was involved in the rescue of British air crews shot down by Japanese fighters, and was in Tokyo Bay to witness the surrender of the Japanese forces. So again, a very, very lively war. Suited him. And of course that stays in the family, so his second son, Prince Andrew, of course, was a naval pilot and took part in the Falklands War as a helicopter pilot. So fairly recently, I think Andrew's previous wife, Princess Ferguson, or ex-wife, actually put on her Instagram. I think he might have sent her a message and she just copy-pasted it onto her Instagram, took it down later, but here was the quote. I was flying and saw a chaff shell fired from one of our ships that passed not that far in front of us. For a moment, it was on a steady bearing before it began to cross to our left. The terror that was going to be that, just for a moment, has had a lasting and permanent effect on me. Of course, Prince Andrew has stepped down from royal duties, but he did have the famous quote when it was accused that he was sweating at a particular party. He said, I didn't sweat at the time because I suffered what I've described as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War. So Prince Andrew, the man who cannot sweat because of a wartime experience, it has been pointed out that that is probably the most Fleming-esque trait of a villain. A man who cannot sweat due to wartime experiences. As far as I know, his father, Prince Philip, sweated like a normal man. But of course, carrying on, the Queen's grandson, Prince William, he, of course, joined the RAF. Flight Lieutenant Wales joined Sea Flight 22 Squadron at RAF Valley in Anglesey in September 2010. So he worked for 3 years as search and rescue pilot, and saw the Duke conduct 156 search and rescue operations and take on routine operational deployment to the Falkland Islands and qualify as an operational captain. I can remember the announcement being put out saying that if you get rescued, you will not be taken to meet the pilot, so do not put yourself deliberately in danger in the hope of meeting a royal prince. I was just amused that announcement had to go out. Of course, after leaving operational duties with the Armed Forces, Prince William retrained to become an air ambulance pilot and worked with the East Anglian Air Ambulance for more than 2 years. So there we go, earning his chops to become a patron of the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and Honorary Air Commandant of the Royal Air Force, Königsby, again highlighting the role of military history as well as creating some of his own. Perhaps better known is his younger brother, Prince Harry, who served in the armed forces for 10 years, rising to the rank of captain and undertaking 2 tours of Afghanistan. Of course, he continues to work in support of his fellow servicemen, promoting support for wounded men and women as they adapt to life post-injury. Of course, his role with the Invictus Games is one of his more prominent duties. Even though he's resigned from royal duties, he's still very much involved. So there we go, the royal family in the front line of combat. Somebody who did not expect to be in the front line of combat was Princess Anne. You may have heard a great episode of Quantum of History that talks about this incident, the kidnapping attempt in 1979. Again, one of the joys of these particular episodes is that they give me the opportunity to just to start looking things up. So I thought one of the best accounts I found of it was from Tatler magazine about the kidnapping attempt, 1974. The attempt took place when the then 23-year-old Anne was travelling back to Buckingham Palace after attending a charity event with her first husband, Captain Mark Phillips. A car blocked their way, and suddenly its driver, Ian Ball, pulled out a handgun Ball shot Anne's chauffeur and her security officer, Jim Beaton, as well as a nearby tabloid journalist who tried to intervene. Beaton had not yet drawn his own weapon when he was shot. Having been hit in the shoulder, the bodyguard attempted to fire back at the assailant but missed. Upon a second attempt, his gun, a Walter PPK, jammed. Ball, who was planning to kidnap the princess for a £2 million ransom, tried to make Anne get out of the car, and she famously replied, "Not bloody likely." Before the situation could escalate any further, the attack was stopped by a passing boxer, Ronnie Russell, who punched Ball in the head. Immediately after the attack, Royal ceased having only one protection officer. When Anne visited Beaton in hospital, she turned up with 2 policemen. From then on, that's what it was. The type of guns used by the bodyguards were also changed. After Beaton's weapon had jammed, the Walters were got rid of overnight. Hear that, James Bond. So yeah, she's impressively calm as a man attempts to kidnap her. And I love the fact that, this was unprecedented at the time. Nobody had ever really made such an attempt on the royal family in decades, by 1974. So they really didn't expect anything to happen. It was just passers-by, randomly intervening. The journalist who was shot and the boxer, Ronnie Russell. And we've seen that recently with knife attacks and all sorts. There's just random people close by. You may recall a while ago there was a terrorist attack near a fish market, and somebody grabbed a narwhal tusk off the wall and attacked the terrorist with a narwhal tusk, and somebody else just hit him over the head with a briefcase. It just seems to be that when we have these events, every man is like, yes, this is the moment I've been waiting for. And there's an attack on a Scottish airport, and some Scottish holidaymaker ran towards a terrorist, kicked him in the nuts, and went on holiday. Always impressive, the British public. The BBC had an article a little while ago on the royal family asking, where does the royal family get its money? Always a good topic. How much do they cost? Every year, the UK government gives the Queen a single payment called the Sovereign Grant, which supports official royal duties and maintains occupied royal palaces. The grant is based on 25% of the Crown Estate's revenue from 2 years previously. The Crown Estate is an independent commercial property business. It includes the 4,800-acre Windsor Great Park and the Ascot Racecourse in Berkshire, as well as residential and commercial property. What I find particularly interesting is that the Crown owns it, not the Queen. So they are the assets of the Crown. Were the Queen to go nuts and want to sell it all and put all the money on the nearest horse race, she wouldn't be allowed, because she has the Crown in, she's looking after it for the next fella. And the next fella, and the next fella, having inherited it from the previous ones. So it's not really hers to sell, it belongs to the Crown. 2 separate, subtly separate things. So she owns the Crown Estate, which makes profits. The profits are paid to Her Majesty's Treasury, the same place where we pay all our taxes. The H.M. Treasury calculates 15 to 25% and gives that as a sovereign grant. Of course, she also receives an income from the Duchy of Lancaster, which I've talked about in a previous episode, and Prince Charles receives an income from the Duchy of Cornwall, which I've also talked about before. So, I feel that's one of the longest kind of headline topics I've ever done, but it was by popular demand. Lots and lots of people wanted to know all about the royal family. The next topic is from Sifu Lamas on Instagram, and he asked the question, can you cover a royal warrant? What is a royal warrant? A royal warrant of appointment is a document that appoints a company or individual in a trading company to the royal household, and which entitles the holder of the royal warrant to use the royal arms in connection with their business. So whether you're buying, HP sauce or Turnbull and Assetai, you see a royal crest on it, that's because they've received a royal warrant. My thought on it is that in the days before kind of Trade Descriptions Act and so on, it gave assurance of quality. If it's good enough for a king, a queen, or royal, it's good enough for you and I. Of course, this all preceding the Consumer Protection Act of 1986, which was enacted to provide a simpler and quicker access to redressal of consumer grievances. But that was the first time in UK law we had the concept of consumer and conferred express additional rights on him. But I got really interested in this, so I looked into the kind of royal warrant association, and they had an FAQ for how long does a Royal Warrant last, normally granted up to 5 years, and then it's renewed in the year before it's due to expire, so they can make a decision whether to carry on. What benefits does it bestow? Well, they receive a handsome Royal Warrant document, a nice piece of paper, the right to display the appropriate coat of arms on their product, which I think is really important, and on their packaging, stationery, advertising and so on, in accordance with the Lord Chamberlain's rules. So I was thinking, what are the Lord Chamberlain's rules? So his rules are, it's a mark of recognition that the warrant holder is a regular supplier of goods and services to one or more of the following: Her Majesty the Queen, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, well, as was, the Royal Highness the Duke, the Prince of Wales, and their respective households, and previously, I believe, the Queen Mother. Do Royal Warrant holders provide their products or services for free? No. All business is conducted on a commercial basis, so the Queen and Prince Charles are not getting free stuff as a result of giving this out. How much does a Royal Warrant cost? Nothing. Okay. The Royal Warrant Holders Association does have some clerical work and administration charges and so on. How many Royal Warrants are there? Approximately 850, held by around 750 companies or individuals, and those include really, really big companies we've all heard of, and Turnbull and Nasser is a pretty small one. So I was just looking at www.royalwarrant.org, the Royal Warrant Holders Association, formed in 1840, basically to make sure that the Royal Warrant continues to be treasured and respected, to make sure they don't all go completely bonkers. I find that really interesting because I see these marks on quite a few products that I buy. Good to see what lies behind it. Again, I really like these topics that get me to Google something. Occasionally, I have a topic where all I need is a trip down memory lane. So thank you very much to Kid Bond Fan. He occasionally messaged me these really, really creative and interesting topics. I always enjoy them. But he just asked me to cover R is for Royal Navy. I think I was the only one to mention it. Of course, I entered Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, as a cadet more than a decade ago and was commissioned as a midshipman. So that's navigation officer. I was part of a University Royal Naval unit, and these are extremely competitive to get into. At least a 75% rejection rate, and some failed afterwards. So it's a pretty small number of people were able to successfully apply, pass through all of the tests, and as a result, as I was going through university, I was spending weekends, evenings, holidays with the Royal Navy. Not quite a holiday. One of my first experiences after passing initial training at Dartmouth was taking charge of a small coastal patrol craft and heading down the Thames. It put me in mind of the opening of The World Is Not Enough, and taking much of the same route, going past the Millennium Dome and Thames Flood Barrier and so on and so on. Ultimately, I took it out to sea, going a bit further than Mr. Bond did, although less exciting, quite sedate in reality. But it was fantastic experiences. I trained with Marines on the ground and the RAF at sea and air. I was the dope on the rope as they winched me up. I don't think it was Prince William who took me up. I doubt it, but you never know. Of course, I did physical training, did the assault courses, navigated ships around Scotland, England, across the North Sea to Amsterdam and Germany. Very interesting night passages and exciting stuff, checking for oil spills, that kind of thing. But my primary focus was learning seamanship and learning to handle boats, ships, anything that floats. It was a great experience. I'm very, very glad I did it. I try and keep in touch with some of the old fellas. But we did a 3-year course. I'd say it's a special one for university undergraduates. We graduated. Some went into the Royal Navy. For myself, I left so that I could carry on my academic career teaching, at the University of Bradford, and then Saudi Arabia, Oman, China, and so on. But I'm very, very glad I did it, and ultimately I did some serious research on naval security. Very, very interesting. Anyway, if you want to see a Royal Navy movie, then then I hope you like Black and White. I don't think there have been many really good ones in recent years. There's The Cruel Sea in 1953, that was released, and In Which We Serve, a war movie released during the war in 1942, directed by Noel Coward, who stars in it, and David Lean, who 20 years later made Lawrence of Arabia, the movie I believe Steven Spielberg has started as his favourite movie. Anyway, that's just my quick trip down memory lane. Happy to talk about more or less in response to requests. The next topic is connected. It's the Royal Air Force, requested, of course, by Purdy302 on Instagram. But you can listen to him on Quantum of History in Quantum of History episode 42, Bond and His Helicopters. As Donnie, the host, said that there have been helicopters in all Bond films except 2. Funny enough, his favourite, Dr. No, and probably mine, The Man with the Golden Gun. Anyway, I had a look at some RAF history from the Ministry of Defence website. It says the Royal Air Force was formed as a separate service, independent of the British Army and Royal Navy, on April 1st, 1918. It was the first time that any country had formed an entirely separate and independent air force. The new service had its own ministry under a Secretary of State for War, and the new RAF was the most powerful air force in the world, with more than 290,000 personnel and nearly 23,000 aircraft. They fought effectively from April 1st, 1918, over the Western Front in support of ground forces. General Jan Christian Smuts said of air power, "There is absolutely no limit to the scale of its future independent war use." Indeed, we'll later see the power of air power in 1940 in the Battle of Britain. Of course, there's the movie directed by the same man who gave us Goldfinger, and with Michael Caine in a fantastic role, and largely true. I do like the film because whilst of course the Battle of Britain was primarily fought by Britons, it does highlight the role, for example, of Polish pilots and I believe Canadian pilots as well. So I really like its focus on who was fighting with us. Back to a suggestion by Kid Bond Fan. He suggested R is for Raleigh, as in Sir Walter Raleigh. Born possibly 1554, we're not so sure, certainly died 1618. He was an English adventurer, writer, and a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. There's the famous story that he spread his cloak across a puddle so Queen Elizabeth could walk across it without getting her feet wet. I read quite a bit about him in the book All the Countries We've Ever Invaded and the Few We Never Got Round To by Stuart Laycock. It mentions him repeatedly for his South American and Caribbean adventures. Out of 193 countries that are currently UN member states, we fought or invaded probably 171, possibly 172. Jaw-dropping 90%. As I say, Raleigh helps us with some of those, as does Sir Francis Drake, especially for South America. Of course, Raleigh tried to establish a colony near Roanoke Island, in what is now North Carolina, which he named Virginia, but he never actually set foot there. What many people think he was brilliant at was self-promotion, creating a narrative, getting startups going. Some people suggested if he was alive today, he'd probably be one of those tech billionaires, really good at hyping up his new creations. 1595, he led an expedition to what is now Venezuela in South America, sailing up the river into the heart of Spain's colonial empire, with whom we were at war at the time. He described the expedition in the book The Discovery of Guyana. Spanish documents and stories told by the Indians convinced him of the existence of El Dorado, a supposedly fabulous city of gold in the interior of South America. He did locate gold mines, but this is one that failed. No one supported his project for colonizing the area. As I say, he had these grand ideas, this grand vision for an English-speaking North America and South America. He was, of course, involved in conflicts of Ireland, like most of the Queen Elizabeth's courtiers at the time, and ultimately he would clash with the King James I, was imprisoned in the Tower of London and put to death. Terrible ending to a man who had once been a great favourite of the crown. So he survives as an interesting personality, an enigmatic personality. There's many, many questions that surround him. He can be presented as a hero or as a scoundrel, but certainly he had a phenomenal imagination, was able to convey his imagined worlds very, very well. So some might say there's a bit of a discrepancy between his visions and his deeds, but then again, what else can I say? He was a politician. Okay, sticking with the suggestions from Kid Bond fan, Robin Hood. Well, I went down to Nottingham a couple of times recently and saw a statue there. There is a statue to him. Was he really from Nottingham? Nobody really seems that sure, which might be why the city of Nottingham doesn't make such a big thing of him. Was he really real? No one's quite sure. He's claimed by quite a few towns around, including Whitby, actually. It's claimed that he had naval-based adventures from Whitby. Hence, there's a place called Robin Hood's Bay that I've taken a naval ship past many times. Although I think the Dracula connection to Whitby is probably a bit stronger. Anyway, he is certainly a very, very popular character in stories, movies, and so on. The events that surround him are certainly real. Bad King John, taking taxes from everybody excessively, and a lot of the politics around that time I think were really well shown in the 2010 Robin Hood film by Ridley Scott, which kind of shows the successive northern rebellions that would eventually lead to the Magna Carta in 1215, and then King John trying to throw out and go back on his word, and then being forced to keep his word and give people rights. Of course, one popular version is 1991, what I call the Alan Rickman version, but I realise some people have it as the Kevin Costner version. Anyway, it's the one where the Sheriff of Nottingham says, "I'm going to cut your heart out with a spoon." Because it's blunt, he has to explain. Supposedly those lines were all rewritten in the pub. Alan Rickman was cast as the evil Sheriff of Nottingham and thought his lines were rubbish. So he went down the pub with a few friends and ended up rewriting it. The actual Sheriff of Nottingham, by the way, did pardon Robin Hood in 2010. The then Sheriff Councillor Ian Malcolm appointed the city's official Robin Hood as under-sheriff. He said, "The Sheriff and Robin Hood have been fighting in and outside the castle for over 900 years, so it's about time we started fighting for it instead." He was, of course, fighting for government funding to try and make Nottingham a bit more of a tourist town, because you go today and there's not a huge amount of celebration of the local hero. The current sheriff, Merlita O'Brien, was born in the parish of St Thomas, which is in Jamaica, in 1951, and came to join her parents in Nottingham in 1962 at the age of 11. Merlita's father worked as a labourer for British Gypsum, and her mother worked in catering for much of her life, and Merlita kind of worked her way up through unions and then into local politics, and then became sheriff. I just think it's a really interesting story and gives us a Jamaica connection, which is always good for the Bond fans. I suppose I could mention the Disney one, the Disney Robin Hood, but I really can't stand talking animals. It's my one rule with movies: there should be no talking animals, so it didn't make a big impact on me, I'm afraid. From something silly to something serious, Sifu Lamus suggested that R is for Remembrance Day. So the Encyclopaedia Britannica defines this: the Remembrance Sunday in the United Kingdom, the holiday held on the second Sunday of November, and it commemorates British service members who've died in wars and other military conflicts since the onset of World War I. By tradition, a 2-minute period of silence is observed throughout the country at 11 a.m, and church services and other ceremonial gatherings take place during the day. This, of course, commemorates the armistice in November the 11th, which happened at 11 a.m. So it's the 11th hour, or the 11th day of the 11th month, the ending of the First World War. And, of course, there are military parades and services, which, of course, I took part in. I can remember one where it was raining so heavily that, of course, I was on my uniform, which is the navy woolly pulley, and the white shirt underneath, and it rained so heavily that my white shirt was dyed by the navy woolly pulley. Not much suffering, just one of those days. But this is, I say, a very, very important day. The British Legion write about this on their website. Remembrance Sunday is a national opportunity to remember the service and sacrifice of all those that defended our freedoms and protected our way of life. We remember the armed forces, their families from Britain and the Commonwealth, the vital role played by the emergency services, and those that have lost their lives as a result of conflict and terrorism. The National Service of Remembrance, held at the Cenotaph in Whitehall on Remembrance Sunday, provides the nation with a physical reminder of all those that have served and sacrificed with British and Commonwealth soldiers, sailors, airmen and women represented together with members of the emergency services and civilians, ensuring no one is forgotten. Certainly with the Remembrance Day parades I've been involved with, we've had the military, of course. At the time, people who had just been on tours of Iraq and Afghanistan, but we also had representatives of the local community, people who were supporting their families and so on, religious leaders, Church of England, the Sikh community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community. It's very much a local event. Of course, the one at the Cenotaph is the national tribute. You have members of the royal family, members of the cabinet, opposition party leaders, former prime ministers, the mayor of London and other ministers. But again, you have representatives of, all major community organisations. It is very much a national day. Okay, moving on to something of historical significance. Bond up north, who I think is quite close to where I am. I'm in Yorkshire. He suggested R is for railroad, and certainly the British Empire built railways all over the world, and railways started here. So it's funny, I don't think I've really covered this on my podcast. Will I cover this on my podcast? Well, I came across this fantastic YouTube video by a channel called Yorkshire's Hidden Histories. As I say, it's a YouTube channel, and there's a video called How Middleton Railway Changed the World. The creator writes, Middleton Railway is the world's oldest continually running railway, but the story of how it was at the forefront of British locomotive history rarely gets told. Its two pioneers, Matthew Murray and John Blenkinsop, were responsible for kick-starting the British railway boom, and not, as it's often believed, George Stephenson. But anyway, so I found this YouTube channel, Yorkshire's Hidden History. It says it so well, I'm not sure if I can say it better, so I might, at this point, just recommend it to there. And interestingly, Stephenson's rocket is an interesting but a very well-known story. This is just another side to that story that I think is worth checking out. So that's Yorkshire's Hidden History on YouTube. Another quick one that I won't go too deeply in, Joseph Space Ranger on Instagram, cool name, suggested Risico. Risico is, of course, an Ian Fleming short story. I hadn't read that in years and years and years, and I loved going back to it, because it forms much of the basis for the movie For Your Eyes Only, which is the first Bond film directed by John Glenn, and it reset the tone of the series after Moonraker. I really, really liked the film, and it was great to go back and read the short story on which a good chunk of it is based. The Instagram account Roger Moore's Cubbyhole suggested R is for Roger Moore. Oh, excuse me as I bash the microphone around. So R is for Roger Moore. I say Roger Moore's Cubbyhole. Because he worked for Cubby Broccoli, I see. So of course, who was Roger Moore? Well, I think he's pretty well known. He's James Bond 007 times, and I think it was the last actor kind of recommended by Ian Fleming, who played the role. And Roger Moore much admired David Niven, and this is referred to, or David Niven, is referred to in the books by Ian Fleming. In You Only Live Twice, there's a reference to him as kind of the good man in Hollywood, who of course left a successful Hollywood career to go and serve in the Second World War, and then returned in triumph, playing Sir James Bond in the 1967 kind of spoof version of Casino Royale. One day I'll watch it. Roger Moore wrote about David Niven in his book Last Man Standing, but I don't know there's a huge amount that I can add. There's a brilliant James Bond podcast out there, so I don't want to cover too much of that territory, but I can't resist adding, there's 7 Roger Moore movies. I do enjoy all of them. The first two, Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, he's kind of playing it like The Saint. Live and Let Die is more written for Sean Connery, but I like it because the movie starts off with the violence of the villain rather than the violence of James Bond doing something. I always like that when the pre-title sequence kind of shows that the baddie is a baddie. And The Man with the Golden Gun is my favourite because Bond only rarely kills one person. He only shoots and kills one person, which is the person he's been sent to kill. Sometimes I think the license to kill is a little bit overused. Like, Bond's going around shooting everybody in some of the more recent films, which, is fun. A fun movie in one sense, but I do quite like it when he actually seems to have some kind of rules of engagement, and it's the baddie who kills people. That's what bad people do. It's the good guys defending people. That's it. I feel The Man with the Golden Gun is really good with that. Of course, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, they're fun, light-hearted adventures. I describe as Marvel-esque. I think if they were released today, they'd fit happily with that pantheon of movies, quite happily. And then, of course, there's the 1980s ones, directed by John Glenn, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill, which I really, really enjoy. I'm not sure if he actually shoots somebody and hits them in A View to a Kill. Again, I quite like it when we get the restrained Bond, and I really like these three, the older ones, because we see him as an older, mature, pretty well-adjusted person. But I say that I feel there's three different types of Bond that Roger Moore played. I think he played them all really well. Okay, another topic. Bond Up North and Bond Suits asked me to cover Range Rover. However, I am not a car expert. I could have a look at Range Rover as it's appeared in Bond films. It has appeared quite frequently as a James Bond car, but of course they're used by the British Armed Forces quite a lot, and when I was growing up, it seemed that every farmer had one, and to be honest, it's kind of my dream car. I think they are just solid and can race about the countryside quite happily. Okay. Excuse me as I glug down the coffee. According to Facebook Martin and Instagram, everybody needs something. I wasn't able to catch what the end of that name was when I got the message. But more importantly, my dad suggested that R is for regiments. So, of course, I was in the Naval Reserves for 3 years, but my dad was a career army officer for 15, 20 years, as was his father, and many other people in my family have been part of the armed forces and so on. So that's why I don't talk too much about what I did. I'll ask him to sit at the table and understand some of the conversation a bit better, but as I say, my father was a serious career army officer, sponsored by the army to go through Cambridge, and left as a major, had some really interesting experiences as a commander in Berlin, and training the Kuwait army, and, well, doing all the good stuff. But he suggested the regimental system in a phone call recently, so I went straight to the National Army Museum's website. Who better to explain than the experts? They describe the regiment or corps as a key administrative component of the British Army. It's the largest permanent organisational unit. Above the regimental level, organisation is changed to meet day-to-day operational demands. Because regiments are permanent organisations, each regiment has its own long history, traditions, insignia, cat badges and the like. A British soldier will usually serve in the same regiment or corps throughout their career. To its soldiers, the regiment is therefore the all-important military family, providing accommodation, welfare, comradeship, and a unique identity. Now, they were originally established as administrative units for specific branches, like the infantry or cavalry. Regiments formed the organisational basis of the army, like the bricks on which the army is built. Has its roots in the 17th century, when both aristocrats and professional soldiers were commissioned by monarchs and parliament to recruit troops. Ranked as colonels, these men raised, dressed, and equipped their regiments. One interesting thing it doesn't say in the original article is that soldiers are often paid at the end of a campaign. Usually all their pay kind of given to them in a big lump. They might have been paid relatively little throughout the campaign. After all, it's quite difficult to carry around the large sums of money that you need to give troops their spending money as they go out and about. So they'd often receive large lump sums, and many of them would use it to start a pub, public house, which of course is why so many pubs, as you travel around the UK, are named after colonels, brigadiers, generals, dukes, and so on, especially if they're very, very historic pubs. Often they were started by soldiers who had left the service of a particular colonel and would name it after them in gratitude. Originally, the colonel of a regiment could put whatever device or badge he chose onto his soldiers' headdresses, but that was forbidden by a royal warrant in 1751. It had to go through an armed services committee after that. I do know in the Second World War they're kind of running out of exciting animals to give to various regiments, and they tried. One regiment tried to have a cuddly panda bear as on their cap badge. I think they were allowed it in training, but it was demanded that they changed it before D-Day. Anyway, the head of a regiment is, of course, the colonel and the colonel-in-chief. Its roots go back to the 17th century when colonels owned and supervised the regiments, and the modern colonel is the head of the family and responsible for the protection of the regiment's interests. So he's almost always an officer holding the rank of general, who at one time served in the regiment. But the more ceremonial, equally important position is the colonel-in-chief, which is normally a member of the royal family, again, keeping those links close. Okay, my final major thing to talk about is Rules Restaurant, suggested by Ladies Who Bond. R is for Rules Restaurant, which is, of course, the oldest restaurant in London. More importantly, the restaurant that appeared in 2015's James Bond film Spectre. M is having a nice little meal at Rules Restaurant, and suddenly Q and Moneypenny come along and spoil his meal by telling him stuff. I went along there for lunch quite a few years ago now. I have to say, absolutely lovely. They own some country estate up in the north of England, and that's where they get their game birds and so on, and it's a lovely, lovely place. Apparently the only place that has House of Commons whiskey outside the House of Commons, and all around the restaurant are these beautiful, beautiful paintings and pictures and sketches, mostly of famous patrons throughout the ages, all kinds of artists and writers and politicians, and pretty well over the last couple of 100 years. Think of any figure in British history as of any significance, and they've probably eaten there. So I guess the most important thing now is for me to try and become a major historical figure, because I've eaten there. So now I feel the onus is on me. Okay. Finally, a few things that I just didn't have time to look into particularly. So Two Green Thumbs suggested R is for Roundheads, but I already covered that. It's one of the sides, the parliamentary side in our Civil War, but I covered that in O is for Oliver Cromwell. Sifu Lamus and Jan on Facebook suggested the Rolling Stones. I'm very aware of putting any copyrighted music onto this podcast. This is all my original sounds, whether they're good or bad, but it seems silly to talk about the Rolling Stones and not play their music. Daniel Gaster cleverly suggested R is for R, Q's assistant in The World Is Not Enough, played by John Cleese, which I liked. You have him as the title R very briefly, and then he becomes Q, I think, in Dine of the Day. Roses, R is for Roses. Of course, there's the English rose. My mind immediately went to the Yorkshire rose, the Lancashire rose, which of course the two major houses in the War of the Roses, ultimately leading to the Tudor rose, which combines them both. Rugby and Rain, suggested by British Bond Addict. Rugby, what is it? Played by animals, watched by gentlemen. It's a great game to watch, and I played it at school. I think both my brothers broke something in playing rugby. I think one broke his leg and one broke his arm. Good gracious. Quite a few kind of suggestions, like Royal Rifle Corps and so on. Spies and Ties suggested that, but again, I feel rarely covered by the regimental system. I could go through each different regiment. Maybe that's more of a deep dive thing in the future. And then a couple of adjectives, which I really liked. On Facebook, Jill said, R is for resourcefulness. We've had some pretty rough times over the past century, so we've developed a make, do and mend mentality, sadly being lost with a modern throwaway society. I'm sure some do throw away. I'm very much a fan of making do and mend myself. And on Facebook, Tim, R is for righteousness and respect. Well, I feel that's a good respectful note to end this podcast on. Thank you very much to everybody who made their suggestions. I hope you enjoyed this. We're back to the alphabet of Britishness, so what can I say? S is for whatever you say it is. You can contact me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies, and on Facebook I'm in the Britain People, Places and Pastimes groups. I ask my questions there. And there's my Albion Never Dies at gmail.com email address. So keep in touch. Let me know what you think, because it's your suggestions that make this podcast. Thank you very, very much for listening. Goodbye.